Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. This is a podcast where we explore fresh ideas and real stories to help you create a workplace where people feel valued, connected, and inspired to do their best work. Each week, we dig into strategies and perspectives that challenge the status quo, because when you transform your workplace, you transform lives. This episode is brought to you by Xenium HR, your complete HR plus payroll solution. Whether you're looking to simplify payroll, stay compliant, or provide expert HR guidance, Xenium acts as an extension of your team so you can focus on growing your business and supporting your people. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. Today's guest is Jayma DuChene, host of the What's in a Name podcast and a friend of mine. And she's somebody with a fascinating passion for the meaning, power, and pronunciation of names. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with workplace culture? Well, I think a lot. Think about it. Your name is part of your identity. You hear it, see it, and write it countless times a day. When someone pronounces it correctly, it signals respect. When they don't, it can have the opposite effect, chipping away at trust and belonging. So in this conversation with Jayma, you're going to hear about why names matter so much in building authentic workplace relationships, how mispronouncing or avoiding a name impacts inclusion and psychological safety at work. You'll hear practical ways leaders can honor the names of their team members and the ripple effect of small intentional actions on a culture. You'll walk away from this episode with a fresh perspective on something you probably overlooked and a few simple practices that can make a big difference in how your people feel at work. All right, here's my conversation with Jayma DuChene. Jayma, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. I'm glad we could finally do this.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me.
So you and I met, I think it's been 3 or 4 years ago. We met at a conference, and I think I told you I had a podcast. You checked it out finally, and I think you listened to some. And then you started your own podcast.
I did.
It's been almost a year ago.
Yeah, exactly. Just over a year. I started last June.
Tell listeners what the name of that podcast is.
Yeah, it's called What's in a Name. So really simple title, but it's been a huge passion of mine, and I love it. I'm almost at 90 episodes now.
It's incredible. In a year's time, you're pumping out more than an episode a week then.
Yeah, for sure.
And as a fellow podcaster, I know how much work goes into that, and you're doing everything on your own. So I'm proud of you for sticking with it, because most people give up after 6 or 8 episodes. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
When we first met, I remember you asked me a question, and you'd asked me what, do you know the meaning of your name? And I've never had anybody ask me that before, and nor have I even researched anything about my name before. What is it about a person's name and the meaning behind it that you've always been fascinated by?
That's a really good question, because I think when we have a weakness in our life, we can either let that break us or make us into who we really should become. And I have never liked my name most of my life because, thank you. I love it now. I do. Yeah. But I never liked it growing up because it got mispronounced so much. And it's spelled, as you can see, phonetically, very simple, Jayma. On a screen, it looks easy to me, but not so much for the first day of school, teachers just always not understanding because they don't see those letters in that order all the time. So I think it just kind of confuses people. And then they second guess themselves because humans tend to overcomplicate things. Yeah. And so I think it's interesting how, because it's been mispronounced so much, I never liked it. But then when I looked up the meaning of it, I thought, wow, this is so cool. And it made a lot of sense to me. And then when I started talking about the meaning of other people's names, seeing the light bulb turn on and them just kind of like lighting up, I think that did it for me. I was like, this is my passion. I love it.
Yeah. It's funny that, not funny, because it's sad that people got your name wrong when you were younger. I would think like your last name is a little bit more challenging
Right?
for people. Do they mess up your last name ever?
I would say so. Yeah, this is my married last name. My
Yeah.
maiden name was Getz, and so that was really easy.
That's easy, yeah.
Yeah, and now it's like DuChene, whatever.
Do most people get it right? I guess people who know you get it right, but
Yeah, for the most part.
yeah. I think when you were talking to me about, and I was a guest on your podcast too, and I think you'd asked me like, when people mispronounce your name, like, how do you feel about that? And it feels crappy. And I remember like kind of after that point, I realized too, like, as we talk about belonging in the workplace and things of that nature, I really made it a point every time I'd get on the podcast before the interview would happen with somebody I've never met, everything's like over email until we get on. I always ask them, regardless if it's easy to, like, it looks easy to pronounce. Yeah, I always ask them how to pronounce their name.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because the names matter to people, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You see it, hear it, read it, write it throughout the whole day.
And it feels crappy when somebody gets it wrong.
Yeah, it really does. And I'm glad that you recognize that, because I think that when another human being goes out of their way to be intentional and recognize that, you are showing your level of emotional intelligence. And that is a huge thing. And I really respect and applaud you for recognizing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you think of like doing the podcast, I guess now you're 90 episodes in, but even before the podcast, when you did a bunch of research on your own name, but even maybe the meaning of other people's names too, what's like the simplest explanation you can give me about why you think it matters so much?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it matters so much because there's so much emotion tied to a word, and your name is a word, and all words have a meaning. They all have a definition. And I think that because you see your name when you log into your computer, you have it in your signature, you have it on Zoom, you introduce yourself, you use it so much throughout the day that I think it has become a point of where it's almost like numbing, and people, they've seen it and heard it and spoken it so much in their life that they don't think that there's any meaning towards it. Yeah. And a lot of people, 40%, almost half of the people who I've interviewed on my podcast did not know the meaning of their own name. So that just blew my mind, because it's like, if you were to replace your name with a negative word, say the word stupid, and you were to introduce yourself, hi, I'm stupid, and you were to write stupid every single day, log into your computer, stupid, and then your last name, that would have an effect on your psyche. That would have an effect on the way you are viewed, and that would have an effect in all facets of your life, because words have power. And I think that just because your name is so unique to you as an individual, a lot of people take it for granted. So I hope that the more that my podcast is recognized and people start to think more about their names, they can actually recognize that there is power in that.
When you started going down this road of doing a lot of research and even asking people about the meaning of their name and just having an interest, did you ever think you were going to do a podcast, and let alone a Disrupt HR talk that you just did a couple months ago?
Yeah. I always knew over the last 3 or 4 years, when I had gotten out of some health issues, I had this idea that just really became a passion of mine, which included onomatology, which is the study of the meaning of names. And I didn't know what to do with that idea. And it took a while, actually. It took a few years to formulate. And I launched a podcast, and then I deleted it completely because I wasn't happy with it. And then a year after that, I had this idea that I woke up with. And I remember sitting in my bed, I pulled my phone out, the notes on my phone, and I just had all these questions in my mind. So I just wrote them down. all the questions that I would ask about anybody's name. And then I just thought, I'm going to ask people who I really respect what they think of these questions. And every single person who I asked was like, yeah, this is amazing. You should make this into a podcast. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do it. And then that whole Disrupt HR talk was icing on the cake. I will say, I will never do something like that again unless somebody like really, really wants me to do it, because it was so nerve-wracking. But I'm so glad that I can check off on my bucket list. I have done public speaking on a stage. So
congratulations on that. Speaking's not easy, let alone like in a 5-minute, like, because you have to cram everything into a 5-minute, and I think you have to have like 30 slides or something like that. So
yeah,
it's hard work. I don't know if I'll ever do something like that. I like sitting behind a microphone doing a podcast because I can edit it. Being on stage is a lot different.
Yeah. Right.
As you've done 90 episodes, and I'm sure you got a bunch more recorded that aren't even out, can you think, besides the one that you did with me, what was maybe the most eye-opening episode, one that maybe taught you something that you didn't know, or just somebody who brought the energy, or just surprised you in general? Can you think of any that came to mind?
Yeah, I actually have a couple, if you don't mind me talking about.
Please.
Yeah. Okay. The first one that comes to mind that was the most impactful was when I interviewed Cameron, and his name means crooked nose. And so when I was like, at first I looked it up and I was like, oh dear God, how am I going to interview him about crooked nose? Right. But the meaning of that name challenged me in such a neat way, because it almost shifted my own paradigm of how I go about researching things, because it forced me to go beneath the surface and look at the symbolism of the words. Because, for instance, like crooked could mean in terms of like quirky, and then nose symbolizes intuition. And he was very lighthearted and had a great sense of humor and had a great intuition. He said that other people would describe himself as having a good sense of humor and being intuitive. And I thought that was really interesting. And also he did happen to have, he said, I happen to have a crooked nose, and it was very prophetic. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think that when I dug deeper, not only did I bring forth more inspiration on how I research things, I think he even like thanked me for shedding light on the symbolism. And I really hope that it does help him in a positive way kind of push forward into his strengths and tap into that. And so I thought that was a really neat episode.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. You said there was another one, right? That's like, stood out to you?
Yeah. So his name is Parham, Parham. And I met him through a workshop for doing like a TEDx workshop. And he was in Canada when I interviewed him. He's originally like mostly born and raised in Sweden, but he was actually born in Iran. And he had a lot of different cultural aspects to him in terms of his education and his mindset. And he had such a high level of emotional intelligence. And when you're talking to somebody and you go deeper into the conversation, you can tell that either they have high emotional intelligence or they have, par, subpar, whatever. And it was just a breath of fresh air to talk to him about his name and how he had overcome a lot of people mispronouncing his name when he moved to Canada. The teacher that he had suggested that he go with the name Peter, just because it would be a little bit easier to assimilate into the culture in Canada. But he ultimately kept his name Parham. And I just thought that it was really neat. He also shed light on the term alter egos. Yeah. So like there's a book that talks about alter egos, and Beyonce, for example, uses one. And so I just thought that was really interesting, because alter egos do have, you tap into that different power zone of yourself if you go by a different name. So there was a lot of ideas that he shared that I thought were very inspiring.
When you run across those that have maybe a hard to pronounce name, I think you're probably comfortable with it now because you have a podcast and you talk to enough people and you're curious that you probably have no problem asking people like how to pronounce their name. But I think for a lot of people, they just don't say somebody's name at all because they're worried about mispronouncing it or getting it wrong. What's some advice that you give people who run into that situation where they're just like, they don't even say a person's name because they're just fearful about saying it wrong?
Yeah, very, very simple. Be humble about it. Be very authentic and very kind. And if I am not 100% sure and confident that I know how to pronounce somebody's first name, I will just say, I really want to get the pronunciation of your name right. Can you please help me with that? And if you
Love it.
are just very humble and very authentic with that person, I think that they will not have any issues with you asking that question.
Yeah. I think it's worth asking the question out of even with fear of like looking stupid or whatever, because people's names matter. I love hearing my name. When
Yeah.
somebody says, "Hey buddy," or "Hey," like because they're not going the effort of saying my name, I get frustrated by that. Or if they spell it wrong in an email, I get that hurts every time. It's like
Yep.
you just were going too fast or you don't care. That's actually what it screams to me, is like you don't care.
Yeah, exactly. It proves that you don't care.
I think of like, this is an HR podcast and leaders and HR people listen to it. And a lot of these folks are trying to create workplaces that have psychological safety, belonging, inclusion, all of that. How does like understanding the meaning of somebody's name, pronouncing it correctly, what kind of message does that send to a culture, a workplace culture? And I'm sure you have this conversation with colleagues too. You and I are in the same industry, so you probably have thought a lot about this.
Yeah. What does it say about a culture?
Meaning, if people were to spend more time pronouncing people's names correctly, understanding each other's the meaning of somebody's name internally, what kind of culture would that create?
It would create a culture of authentic curiousness in terms of there is no wrong in that regard. And everyone is on the same level, but they have their own unique seat at the table. There's no hierarchy in that.
Mm,
And I think that that is huge in terms of belonging and authenticity in the workplace.
I love that. Given the fact that many organizations are doing virtual calls like this, what have you learned about, I mean, now that you have access to people all over the world through your podcast, and I know the organization you work for, you're across different time zones and probably different cultures as well. What is understanding the meaning behind somebody's name with all the work that you've done help you like kind of honor the people who don't live in the same area as you, and but yet you're working together and collaborating?
Yeah, I absolutely love this question. I love the fact that my podcast has given me the opportunity to talk to people in 8 different countries. And
Incredible.
I have learned so much from the people who I have interviewed who reside in different countries, especially the person who I work with. And his name is Salim, and I work with him on several projects. He lives in India. His name means peaceful. And I asked him to do the podcast. I was very nervous to ask him to do this because we
Really?
were on such a very strict professional level of rapport,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
But I was like, he actually liked one of my posts on LinkedIn when I shared about my podcast. So that gave me a
Love
thought.
that.
And I
Doors
was like,
open.
maybe I'll email him and ask him if he wants to be on. And so then he was like, yeah, I'd love to be on. And it was like this window opened to this whole new world of us learning about each other, just like on a little bit deeper level in terms of respecting each other more, and not just in terms of like, okay, this next project, what are the details of the project? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, like we actually had other questions about, our cultures and our families and our upbringing. And it was like a whole new world that we were able to explore. And it was so wonderful. And now when we get on Zoom calls, it's even better. I
I
love
love
it.
that. Yeah, leaning into that, you're building bridges and building relationships. I love everything about that. Let's talk about the opposite, because I know you've talked about this probably on your podcast, which is like people shortening their names or changing it to either fit in or just not go through the pain of mispronunciation. I know this happened a lot back in school, like elementary school. I can remember people having nicknames or shortening their names because they're tired of like the roll call when the teacher would butcher it every time.
Yeah.
I know this happens in the workplace too. What are your thoughts on this?
I have a perfect example for this. So I was recently working with another contractor. So he's at a different company, but he had a huge project with my company. And he went by AJ because it's easy to pronounce and say and, converse with. But his legal name is Abijot, and he lives in California, but he has a wonderful background. And when I was talking to him, he was like, well, I go by AJ because it's easier, but my name is Abijot. And I was like, I love your name. It's so cool.
I've never heard that name before.
Yeah, he's like, you can use either one. I was like, well, I'm going to use your name, whichever one you feel comfortable with. But if that's your name, you should go by it. And he did say, like, growing up in sports, he would go by AJ just because in sports, it's easier for the coach to call out AJ. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but also like, oh my gosh, why would you have to do that, to fit the culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it happens all too often, and names are important to people, and they shouldn't have to flex to fit in, quite frankly. So since you've probably thought about this a lot, like in terms of like exercises that leaders could do in the workplace to understand people's names, help with pronunciation, like is there any like quick tips for leaders that you'd recommend as far as like either pronunciation or getting to understand people, maybe as an icebreaker or something like that?
Yeah, I think an icebreaker would be ideal for understanding the meaning of everybody's names in terms of, especially if you have somebody new that you bring into your team. You could start with yourself. I always start with myself as an example and just, I would say, hi, my name is Jayma and it means paradigm shifter. And we're going to go around the room and you're going to state your name and the meaning of your name. And if you don't know it, you've got Google right next to you. Or, whatever. But then you could go the extra mile and you could go ahead and look up the meaning of the names of everybody on your team. And then you could ask if they already know it. And then if not, you could share it. And then it kind of just shows that you went that extra mile and you learned a little bit more about each other.
Love it.
Yeah.
So now that you're 90 episodes into the podcast, where do you see this going? I mean, what do you want to do with it in the end?
Yeah, I actually want to do, once I hit 100 people, I want to go back to the very beginning and do round 2 with everybody. I'd love to get more context on the person that I interviewed, because starting out, I feel like as you gradually do more and more podcast episodes, you learn more and more about how to do a podcast. And when I first started, I did not really do any kind of introduction. I just kind of jumped right into it. And so I want to share more information about those people that I interviewed. And then I also want to ask them how, from doing the podcast, how has that made them start thinking about other people that they interact with, and how has that had an impact in their life?
When you launched the podcast, I think you reached out to me and said, "Hey, well, the first one I want to be me, and you needed somebody to interview you." So I did that, and I was like, I was so honored to do that. And and having done that, and then you interviewed me about my name, I started thinking about it a lot more. And then, of course, I follow your content, and so I think about it more than I ever have. And I've never really seen content on this, so I love the work that you're doing. I think you should keep it up. I'm glad you are sticking with it. To close my podcast, I always like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Because I know you're well read. You educate yourself in so many different ways. What's an experience that you've had, whether it's experience, a person, or an idea that's shaped the way you think about work, leadership, transforming culture, and how does that influence you to this day?
Yeah, I love that question. So I've said this multiple times, and I will say it for however long when anybody asks me this question. So I worked for this man. His name is Jeff, and the name Jeff means God's peace. And he was very peaceful in my life and such a wise person and almost like a mentor in a way. And he said, I will just never forget. I had this very difficult interaction with someone at work. And he just said in the most peaceful way, the only thing that you have control over is your reaction. And that sentence has been a part of the way that I conduct all of my interactions with everyone in my life is, you cannot control what somebody says to you, how they react to what you do and what you present, but you can control your reaction to it. And that is something that I try to work towards in terms of making myself be more improved in that way, in just being calm and collected and professional. And then if I need to process, taking that step back.
I wish I had heard this when my kids were like younger, because you can't control their reactions when they're emotionally unstable.
Yeah.
But that advice is so good in the workplace too, and in any professional interaction. But definitely with kids, that advice would have been great. Jayma, I've loved having you on. I'm so thankful that I got to meet you years ago and continue this friendship. Keep it up with the podcast. Where can people learn more about your work, whether it's the podcast or your professional work, or connect with you or anything like that?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I am on LinkedIn as well as Spotify and Apple and several other podcast platforms, but I always share my Apple and Spotify podcast link on Instagram. So I also have a main Instagram page. It's all under What's in a Name. If you look for that, you'll probably find it.
Jayma, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brandon. I really enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.